You may not know this, but there are only 4 carriers nationwide in the United States.
Which one is best for RVing and cruising? Hi there, I'm Cherie,
And I'm Chris.
and we are the host of the Mobile Internet Resource Center, where we focus on mobile internet solutions for RVers, cruisers, and nomads.
So today we're going to talk about the key differences and just really explain that there really are only 4 cellular carriers that cover the entire United States, despite all the brand names and stuff you see, and we're going to explain the key differences between them and some of the trade-offs you might make when you're choosing them.
And when you're choosing the carrier, or in most of our cases, carriers, for your travels, you need to look at their coverage maps, their available data plans, which we're not going to cover in this video. They change way too often. We have separate guides to that. And it's also how well they perform using as a mobile internet solution. So we're going to give you a brief recap of the 4 major carriers and talk about some of the future roadmaps for them.
Let's go dive in and compare the 4.
Okay, Verizon. Ask in any RVing or cruising group, what is the best carrier? Verizon is probably going to be mentioned the most often, if not always. Verizon does have the widest LTE coverage map across the nation. They are going to cover you in more places, especially when you get outside of major cities. However, a lot of reports that we're getting from RVers and cruisers is that they are getting slower speeds on Verizon, and in less places they're able to get usable connectivity. And the reason for that is a lot of Verizon's plans are subject now to network management, and they also are highly congested when you get to an area. So you go to a snowbirding hotspot and all of your RVing neighbors have Verizon. Well, guess what? With them all streaming Netflix or watching YouTube videos, that's going to bring down the tower.
So Verizon got a head start. They were the first carrier to roll out LTE in the United States, and they had bought out this spectrum that gave them nationwide coverage. So they had a really easy job of rolling out coverage everywhere, and they've added several more bands of coverage that if you have newer devices you could take advantage of. This gave Verizon a really great head start, but they don't have a ton of spare spectrum lying around, so that is why they are so subject to congestion issues, and they're also a victim of their own success, particularly among RVers. So many have heard Verizon's great that, well, those towers then end up overloaded just because everybody is trying to climb the same tower, basically. So that is Verizon's catch, and it really makes Verizon a great carrier to have on board, but sometimes not best as your only carrier on board.
So we definitely still recommend having Verizon in your setup if mobile internet's important to you. Just know they probably aren't going to be your always carrier. All right, AT&T, the nation's second carrier as far as LTE coverage across the nation, and they have been building out a lot of coverage, and they are becoming a close second to Verizon. And reports we're getting from a lot of RVers and cruisers is they're able to use AT&T's network as a primary carrier more and more often, and it is the option that they are going with, and that's because AT&T just has a lot more spectrum to go around, and they are delivering a lot of faster speeds now across the country, and at present time, they have the most available unlimited data plans available, especially to RVers and cruisers. So why is it that AT&T is now becoming like a top carrier?
So AT&T has kind of more of a hodgepodge of spectrum nationwide, and it varies from place to place to place. So some areas are really great AT&T, and some areas might not be. There's a lot more variation. But one advantage AT&T has recently is they've been rolling out, they got the government contract to deploy FirstNet, which is an LTE network for first responders, ambulance, police, everything like that, nationwide. And so as part of that contract, AT&T has had to climb every cell tower to install this FirstNet equipment, which is LTE band 14. In the process, they just use that as an excuse to upgrade all their towers, so a lot of extra speed. And, well, the real secret catch with FirstNet is it prioritizes for first responders, but any AT&T customer who's got an LTE band 14 compatible device can also tap into the FirstNet network when it's not currently in active use. First responders have priority, but all AT&T customers get to use it. Now, because AT&T has such a hodgepodge network, and they've added so many different LTE bands, including FirstNet most recently, a lot of older devices don't support the features that AT&T has rolled out. Particularly FirstNet is really rare. So if you want to tap into the best that AT&T has to offer. It really pays to have a recent device with support for all of these LTE bands.
So for RVers and cruisers that are needing mobile internet, definitely recommend AT&T as a top consideration when you are selecting your plans. Okay, T-Mobile, the Un-carrier. They have done a lot to shake up the industry, and we can attribute them to the availability of a lot of the data plans and policies that are now in place with the carriers, as they have driven a competitive force to come out of a last fourth place just a few years ago to now a solid third place carrier as far as nationwide LTE coverage. And they are on a path to try to compete with, well, they call them Dumb and Dumber. We call them Verizon and AT&T. And they are really doing it. They have invested a lot in going forward. And what are those investments, and what are they doing?
So T-Mobile, yeah, again, starting from way in fourth place, and they had a really big weakness when it came to long-range coverage. They had great support to some of the fastest networks in cities, but they had no spectrum that traveled a long distance. But over the years, T-Mobile bought up a whole bunch of LTE Band 12, and even though there was no devices that supported it, they pushed it, and now most devices support Band 12, and that gave them some good rural coverage. And then even more recently, and more importantly, they've been buying up 600 megahertz spectrum. This is a whole bunch of UHF channels that are being shut down, and T-Mobile is getting that spectrum. That is LTE Band 71, and that travels further than basically any other LTE band. It really lets them rival AT&T and Verizon, which had more of this long-range spectrum to start with. And as these UHF channels are shutting down, T-Mobile is able to deploy this Band 71 and really, really improve their rural coverage and their penetration through walls and inside of buildings because of the long-range spectrum. But again, the key is Band 71 support is still very rare. Not a lot of devices support it. So if you want to be able to tap into all this new coverage that T-Mobile is rolling out, you really need to consider upgrading, making sure you have support for Band 71, and that you're able to tap into all this great work that T-Mobile is doing, because when their network is present, they're still in third place, but when their network is present, they've done a lot to make it sure it is very, very fast.
And we do get regular reports from those who are utilizing T-Mobile in the travels that they get some of the fastest speed when they have a solid T-Mobile signal. There's a lot of interesting things happening with T-Mobile, and that's, of course, the pending merger with Sprint. And they announced that well over a year ago. There's been a lot of hoops and hurdles for them to get through. They have passed FCC and DOJ nod of approval on that, and they still have a ways to go to get approval from some state attorney generals and some of the lawsuits up against them. It's probably not going to be until early 2020 that this is decided. And we've been holding off on doing this video if it's going to be 4 carriers or 3 carriers or whatnot. But Sprint, it has been the 4th place carrier for a long time. They have traditionally always been the carrier that if you needed urban connectivity, they were a fine option. But once you got off of interstates, Sprint was not an option that many RVers or cruisers standardize on. Now, the terms of this pending merger with T-Mobile is that they are getting some roaming access onto T-Mobile's network. So devices that support those T-Mobile bands are automatically starting to roam onto T-Mobile with no limitations. And that is irregardless of the merger with T-Mobile. And that's making Sprint a lot more interesting these days. But what is unique about Sprint and their roadmap?
So Sprint is started off with 3 LTE bands, 25, 26, and 41, that none of the other carriers use. So that means that a lot of traditional Sprint hardware only worked on Sprint. And Sprint's network was really, really good in urban areas, and they actually have more spectrum than anybody else. But being in 4th place and financially struggling, they've not been able to invest in deploying all of that, and particularly into rural areas and everything else. So Sprint has been the least recommended carrier for so many people, for so many reasons, but you're traveling far afield, particularly RVers. Now that this merger is happening, suddenly Sprint is gaining access to all of T-Mobile's bands. So if you have Sprint hardware, make sure you have support for all the LTE bands that T-Mobile has. And going forward, Sprint's fast urban spectrum combined with T-Mobile's 600 megahertz spectrum, if they become a merged unit, will give you kind of the best of all worlds. You have some really great rural stuff, you have some really fast urban stuff, and sets them up as a really, a great foundation for evolving towards pushing LTE to its limits and towards 5G.
So, Sprint, also an interesting carrier to be watching right now. There are some interesting data plans that you can get on that are unlimited, that now that you can tap into T-Mobile makes them a carrier to consider as well.
And one other important tip is that merger agreement does not go both ways, so that T-Mobile cannot roam onto Sprint's network until the merger is concluded, but Sprint can merge onto T-Mobile's network now, even before the merger concludes. So it's an advantage for Sprint right there.
Okay, we just went over the current 4 major nationwide carriers, and you've probably heard of a lot of other cellular carriers out there or providers. Some of them are regional carriers, like US Cellular. They are their own entity. They have coverage on their own towers, but they only have it in select areas around the country. They're not something that you're going to be able to go nationwide with.
Yeah, the catch with these regional carriers, and there are a lot of them, some of them only cover a small part of a state even, is they might have nationwide roaming agreements, and they will work if you live in that core area, but if you're outside of your core area for too long, they will have to cancel your service because they're paying crazy roaming fees for you to be on AT&T or Verizon's or T-Mobile's network nationwide. So if you're a big-time traveler, don't really consider the regional carriers.
But if you do find yourself settled in one area for a while, the regional carriers might be worth looking into for those specific needs. Now, other carriers that you might see out there, they're not really carriers. They are just resellers or MVNOs, mobile virtual network operators, in which they are buying bulk bandwidth on one of the major carriers and reselling it under their name with their own plans. Some ones you might be familiar with: Straight Talk, Consumer Cellular, Freedom Pop, Google Fi. They are all just reselling spectrum. So you do need to look behind the scenes as to what carrier is behind them.
Yeah, some of these ones are actually owned by a bigger carrier. So, like Visible is a subsidiary of Verizon, and Cricket
Wireless
is a subsidiary of AT&T. So they've got a clear parent. But others, sometimes, like Straight Talk, they bulk buy data from multiple carriers, but their SIM cards and their plans and their devices are tied to one or the other. So you really have to do your homework and know, am I buying a Straight Talk that's on Verizon or a Straight Talk that's on AT&T behind the scenes? Because your coverage and performance will be very, very different depending on what you buy.
And then there's resellers as well, who are basically just leasing you plans on the carriers themselves. So you might be familiar with NetBuddy, OTR Mobile, and many of the other Unlimitedville and places like that, where they are not actually buying bulk and then distributing it. They are just leasing you an individual plan.
Right. So in that case, your device will still say AT&T or Verizon or whatever on it, because they're not hiding it under a Cricket name or something like that. So they're kind of a less fancy version.
So that's why there's 4 carriers, but a whole bunch of other people that you can buy your plans to. And it is worth the effort to go and research the right plan for you and making sure you're understanding the unique terms and conditions of the plans that you are considering.
Now, there's one special MVNO that does things a little bit different, and that is Google Fi, and that they are so far the only one that actually has a special SIM card that taps into multiple networks at once and will pick between them. So in the case of Google Fi, they have a deal with T-Mobile, Sprint, and US Cellular, and whichever one has the best coverage in a particular area, it will switch between it. So you're not tied to just a single coverage map with Google Fi. It's a little bit different than the rest.
Pretty cool.
Now, we've given you kind of a status update of where the 4 carriers are when it comes to 4G LTE. What about 5G? We're hearing all about 5G in the news now. All the carriers, every one of the carriers have announced 5G devices and 5G plans. But where we stand here at the mid-2019 timeframe, 5G is still just getting started. You can kind of think of it almost as in public beta. So unless you're in a core urban area and really need it, any of the devices you buy in 2019 are going to be obsolete in 2020. 5G starts to get interesting in 2020, and the carriers will actually be able to roll it out surprisingly fast, because a lot of the network upgrades they've been making in the past few years are going to allow 4G and 5G to overlay on top of each other. So they'll be able to turn on 5G coverage in a broader area nationwide pretty quickly. But again, the current hardware being sold in 2019, most of it won't be able to take advantage of that overlay feature in 2020. And 5G hardware is going to get cheaper, better, faster, and much more interesting in 2020, 2021, and beyond. Don't stress about it now, but we're tracking all 4 carriers, and they all have really ambitious plans.
All right, so that's an overview of the 4 carriers as they stand right now in September 2019. A lot can change, but hopefully, as you can see, there's not a single best carrier for RVers and cruisers.
No, and it really comes down to picking the one that fits you best for the plans, the devices you can get, the coverage in places you need to go, and then really importantly, how much redundancy do you need? Do you need 2 carriers on board or 3 carriers on board? Because sometimes that is really the best possible way to fill in the gaps, because there is no one universal best.
Especially as you're traveling. One carrier may excel at this location, and when we move to our next location, it's going to be a different carrier that is our best option. And as you zoom in on those coverage maps, you're going to see that variation as you get down to a locality, and that's where it becomes very important to do some research as to what's going to work best for your travels. Now, for picking out your data plans, we have a guide specific to that, and we put out about a quarterly video updating our current top data plan picks for RVers and cruisers. You can find that at mobileinternetinfo.com/plan picks.
Now, this is so much stuff to decide, so many different factors to weigh. We understand this is confusing. That's why we offer a ton of content on picking plans, picking devices, picking your cellular boosting gear, and different ways to improve your signal, all at our site, the Mobile Internet Resource Center. But all of this is funded by our members.
And our MIAs are who make this all possible to provide the free content that we do. And for their support, we go a lot deeper with in-depth guides, a classroom, product reviews, alert newsletters,
interactive forums.
Yes, with the forums and webinars that we do, so we can help them interactively pick their right plans for them. So if mobile internet's going to be an important part of your journey ahead, please do consider becoming a member and supporting this work and letting us help you even more. All right, thanks. We'll update this video when there's 3 carriers or 5 or 4.
It's always changing, so stay tuned.
These videos are brought to you by our premium members, our mobile internet aficionados. They make it possible for us to track this news and create these videos. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, or better yet, consider becoming a member yourself.